For steaks, there are lots of different cuts of steak. My premise with steak is that I'm paying a premium for a very good piece of meat. So I'm of the belief that the less amount of flavors I can put on the meat other than the flavor that I'm paying for, the better. So my favorite things to use on steak is olive oil and fresh cracked pepper and some kosher salt. Feel free to experiment with whatever seasonings or marinades you like, but if you're paying a high price for a good piece of meat, it's best to taste the meat instead of the A1 sauce or Worcestershire sauce that a lot of folks like to use in a steak marinade. These are strip steaks. They're approximately 1 inch to 1 1/8 inches thick. To me, this is the ideal thickness for cooking a steak. Much thinner than that, and it's very easy to cook the steak all the way through. Much thicker than that, and it's very, very difficult in order to get the steak cooked to the same degree throughout. So about 1 inch, 1.5 inches is about what I like. For fillets, you'll naturally have to have something a little thicker. Takes a little bit more skill to get it just right, but with some practice, it's very easy to cook a fillet to medium or medium rare. Now for these strip steaks, it's going to take a little bit of olive oil and actually rub it over the top of them. Once again, the oil will help brown the meat, as well as help the seasoning actually adhere to the outside. Once again, the seasoning is a very basic mixture. It's a little bit of kosher salt, and some fresh black pepper. I prefer fresh cracked pepper because it has a better flavor than canned pre-ground pepper. And when grilling items, I tend to over-season in comparison to what I would cook inside. The reason is when you cook inside, all of the seasoning you put on the food is going to stay in the pan or vessel that you're cooking it in. We're cooking on the grill, a lot of it is going to fall down as you're turning the meat or moving it around. So I add a little bit more because a lot of it is going to fall off. And I want to sear my steaks on the outside, locking in the flavor and juices. So I'm going to raise the firebox up all the way up to the top. My test for checking to see if the fire is hot enough to sear a steak is to actually put my hand right over the fire. If I can hold it there for no less than a second, it's hot enough to sear. I counted to 3 that time, so we'll give it just another minute or 2. We're leaving the lid open. That allows unrestricted air to the charcoal, and the charcoal gets hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. So if you're going to leave the lid open, don't leave the Hasty-Bake unattended. Getting closer. It was about 2 seconds. Time to get on my gloves. And once again, depending on the thickness of the steak, cooking time will vary. I typically do my cooking by steak texture as opposed to a time or a temperature. I'll talk about the texture of doneness here in just a minute. I take my steak and actually lay it on the grate at a 45-degree angle, right over the hottest part of the fire. Now what I'll do is give it a 60-second sear. You can count in your head for about 12 1000, 13 1000, 14 1000. You can use a timer if you're big on that. If you have a good internal timer though, you can kind of get an idea of when it's been about a minute. Now as the steak begins to cook, the fat will begin to render out of it and drip down to the fire. If you begin to get excessive flare-up, you can always lower the firebox down away from the steak. Some folks don't like to use a fork to flip their steaks, and I'm one of those folks. I prefer to use a tong. If a tender enough steak and you grab it with a fork, the steak could just rip and the meat could fall right on the ground, so I prefer to actually use a tong. So now we're almost up to our minute sear. After the minute sear, we'll take the steaks, leave them on the same side, and turn them at a 45-degree angle going the other way. You can use a meat thermometer to tell steak doneness, but it's very difficult because a steak isn't a very large piece of meat. So it's very easy to go from being medium to being well done. So I prefer to use a texture method. Now that it's been almost another minute here on the other side, let's take a look at the steaks and see if we have a nice sear on the side here. That's what we want there. Nice black cross hatches where the cooking grates have seared in the flavor. Let's put the steak back on and sear the other side. When I talk about the texture of the steak, I'm referring to the actual feel of it. When a steak is raw, it's very, very soft to the touch. To give you an example, if you touch your index finger to your thumb lightly, not pushing together, and then feel the flesh here, it feels very soft. This is what a medium to medium rare steak will feel like. As you move your fingers down with your thumb, the muscle gradually gets tighter and tighter, just like a steak does as it gets more and more well done. So for reference, this is well done. This would be medium, and this would be medium rare. We're getting a little bit of flare up here, so I'm going to lower the fire down. Steaks are almost done with their sear. So what I'm going to do is close the lid down, help snuff the fire. Then we'll shift the steaks off to the side. I'm going to move the steaks over here off to the side. If I touch them, they feel very, very rare. Still pretty soft. The thicker one is a little softer than the thinner one, obviously. The thicker one is going to cook slightly slower than the thinner one. Our chicken's still over here experiencing the indirect heat. Take a look at our steaks and see what the texture of them is. They're really pretty close to medium. Medium is the type of steak I like. Medium steak typically is pink, but with no blood. So I'm going to pull these steaks and allow them to rest. If you take a steak right off of the grill, like cut into it, it's going to leak out a lot of its moisture and juices. If you take it out and let it rest for a few minutes, it'll help absorb those juices back into the meat as it's finishing off. Now our steak here, we're trying to do medium, which is pink in the middle but with no blood. I'm not sure if the camera does it justice or not, but there's pink in the middle, plenty of juice, but with no blood. And remember, the texture for medium is going to be the thumb and the middle finger pushed together. Right there is going to be medium. It takes a little bit of practice, but it's always consistent.